The day an empire stopped to question one human was the day it began to question itself. Ash drifted through the morning air like gray snow, settling across polished stone and silent shoulders as the Imperial Square awakened beneath the pale glow of 3 distant suns. Massive obsidian pillars surrounded the plaza, each carved with centuries of victories that had taught an entire civilization one lesson above all others. Obedience was survival. Thousands of citizens filled the circular terraces in complete silence, their turquoise, emerald, and violet skin reflecting the cold light from towering energy pylons that hummed with quiet precision. No one spoke above a whisper. No one looked away from the elevated platform standing at the center of the square. A single figure knelt there with her hands restrained before her, her silver hair stirred gently by the steady wind that carried the scent of heated metal and distant rain. Lasara kept her golden eyes fixed on the polished floor beneath her instead of the countless strangers watching from every direction. She no longer counted the hours since her arrest. She no longer searched the crowd for a familiar face. Hope had become too expensive long before sunrise. High above the platform, immense banners bearing the Imperial crest swayed without sound, while rows of ceremonial guards remained perfectly still in armor so flawlessly maintained they reflected the entire square like dark mirrors. Their pulse lances rested against their shoulders with practiced discipline. Every movement had been rehearsed. Every heartbeat belonged to protocol. Somewhere beyond the enormous walls surrounding the capital, freight engines rumbled across orbital lanes, carrying supplies toward distant colonies, completely unaware that another judgment was about to become another forgotten page in Imperial history. Near the outer edge of the plaza, Ethan Carter adjusted the worn maintenance gloves tucked beneath his utility belt. His dark, gray engineering jacket still carried faint traces of coolant from the orbital dock where he had worked through the night repairing damaged reactor conduits. He had never planned to visit the Imperial District. His shuttle home had been delayed after security closed half the transit lines for the public execution. Like everyone else stranded in the city center, he simply followed the redirected crowd until he found himself standing among thousands of silent spectators. He did not know the woman on the platform. He did not know what law she had broken. He did not know her species beyond the translator identifying her as Varelian. Around him, conversations remained carefully muted. An elderly merchant lowered his gaze. A mother quietly pulled her young son closer. Even the children somehow understood that this was not a place for questions. Above the square, a calm synthetic voice echoed from hidden speakers. Imperial judgment is now entering its final phase. The announcement rolled across the stone like distant thunder. Several mechanical drones floated into position, projecting soft columns of white light around the platform. Their scanners swept methodically across the crowd before locking onto the restrained prisoner. Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. It was not fear. It was something quieter, something far less reasonable. Lasara slowly lifted her eyes for the first time. They wandered across thousands of unfamiliar faces searching for one impossible miracle before settling on empty expressions that refused to meet hers. Not hatred, not satisfaction, only acceptance, as though everyone had already agreed that whatever happened next belonged to someone else. The chief magistrate stepped onto the platform carrying a crystalline data seal that glowed with Imperial authorization. His voice remained calm, practiced, almost gentle as he prepared to conclude the proceeding. Ethan barely heard the words. What he noticed instead was the way Lasara closed her eyes for just a second, drew one steady breath, and accepted her fate without asking anyone to save her. Something inside him refused to remain still. Before logic could catch him, before caution could remind him whose empire this was, Ethan Carter stepped out from the crowd and walked toward the platform, every pair of eyes slowly turning to follow the one human who had just broken the only rule everyone else had obeyed. Ethan heard the sharp intake of breath ripple through the square before the silence became even heavier than before. Every step of his worn work boots echoed across the polished stone with a sound that seemed impossibly loud against the endless stillness. He neither hurried nor hesitated. His maintenance jacket, stained with reactor coolant and fine metallic dust, looked painfully ordinary beneath the towering banners of the Empire. There were no medals pinned to his chest. No ceremonial armor covered his shoulders. He carried nothing except a small engineering toolkit hanging from his belt, the same one he used every day aboard Orbital Dock 17. One of the nearest Imperial guards shifted slightly, more from surprise than hostility. Humans were still uncommon inside the capital, usually arriving as engineers, scientific consultants, or cargo specialists under carefully supervised contracts. They repaired stations, calibrated orbital arrays, and departed without drawing attention. They certainly did not interrupt public ceremonies. The synthetic announcer paused mid-sentence. Tiny surveillance drones hovering above the platform adjusted their positions, dozens of polished lenses focusing on the lone human approaching the center of the square. Somewhere behind Ethan, whispers finally escaped the disciplined silence. "What is he doing?" someone murmured. "Does he know the law?" Another voice answered quietly. Ethan ignored every word. His heartbeat remained steady, not because he lacked fear, but because there was no time left to negotiate with it. He remembered another morning years earlier aboard a damaged rescue frigate drifting near Jupiter Station. An older Marine medic had once looked at him while treating frightened civilians and said, "Doing the right thing rarely feels convenient." Ethan had laughed back then. Now those simple words returned with startling clarity. As he reached the first security boundary, a translucent energy barrier shimmered across the platform entrance. One guard stepped forward and raised an open hand. "Civilian, this area is restricted." His translator rendered the command in calm, perfect English. Ethan stopped exactly 1 pace away. He looked at the guard, then beyond him toward Lasara. She had opened her eyes again. Their golden color reflected the pale light surrounding the platform. But what caught Ethan's attention was not fear. It was confusion. She studied him as if trying to understand why a stranger had willingly entered a place everyone else was desperate to leave. Ethan inhaled slowly. "I would like to speak." The guard blinked once. "There is nothing to discuss." "There always is." Another officer approached carrying a glowing data tablet. He quickly scanned Ethan's identification badge clipped inside his jacket. Ethan Carter, Earth citizen, licensed orbital systems engineer, temporary Imperial infrastructure contractor. The officer frowned. "You have no legal standing in this proceeding." Ethan nodded. "I know." Then returned to the public observation area immediately. Ethan remained where he was. Around the square, thousands of spectators watched without moving. Many had witnessed military victories, diplomatic summits, and imperial celebrations within these same walls, yet none could remember seeing someone answer authority with such quiet composure. He was not shouting. He was not protesting. He simply refused to step backward. The chief magistrate descended 1 level from the execution platform, studying the human with measured curiosity. His long ceremonial robe barely stirred despite the steady breeze. "You have interrupted Imperial judgment," he said. "Do you understand the seriousness of your decision?" Ethan met his gaze without arrogance. "I understand that I saw someone who has not been heard." The magistrate remained silent for several long seconds. Even the surveillance drones seemed motionless now, recording every expression. Then the magistrate asked the question that spread through the square like a distant bell. "Are you acquainted with the accused?" Ethan glanced toward Lasara. Their eyes met for only an instant. She gave the slightest shake of her head, silently confirming the truth before he spoke it aloud. "No," Ethan answered. "I have never met her before today." Lasara stared at the human as though he had stepped out of a story told only to children. Among her people, strangers did not interrupt Imperial judgment. They protected their own families, their own clans, and their own futures. No one willingly stood between another person and the full weight of the law. Yet Ethan remained exactly where he was, his shoulders relaxed, his hands visible at his sides, looking less like a challenger and more like an ordinary man who had simply refused to keep walking. The chief magistrate slowly circled him, studying every detail. The faded stitching on Ethan's work jacket, the scratched steel clasp securing his utility belt, the calluses across his hands earned from years of tightening bolts instead of carrying weapons. There was nothing remarkable about him except the calm expression that refused to disappear. Around the square, thousands of silent witnesses continued watching with growing uncertainty. The ceremony had followed the same script for generations, each movement rehearsed with mathematical precision. Today that rhythm had fractured because one outsider had asked for something the Empire rarely offered: time. A soft chime echoed from the surveillance drones as they transmitted live images toward the Imperial Palace overlooking the city. Far above the square, behind walls of polished black stone, advisors and officials quietly redirected their attention from scheduled meetings to the unexpected interruption unfolding below. Inside the palace command chamber, rows of holographic displays awakened one after another. An elderly minister folded his hands. "The human has no legal authority," he observed. Another official replied without taking his eyes off the screen. "No, but now he has everyone's attention." Back in the square, the magistrate stopped directly before Ethan. "You admit that you do not know the accused. You possess no evidence regarding her innocence. You have no standing under Imperial law. Explain your actions." Ethan glanced toward the towering statues surrounding the plaza. Their stone faces honored rulers, generals, and explorers whose names had shaped the empire for centuries. Then he looked back at the magistrate. "I am not asking you to declare her innocent." The magistrate narrowed his eyes. "Then what are you asking?" Ethan answered without raising his voice. "I am asking you to make certain." A ripple spread across the terraces. Several spectators exchanged uncertain looks. The words sounded almost absurd in their simplicity. Imperial judgments were trusted precisely because they were believed to be certain already. To question certainty itself felt strangely unfamiliar. Lysara lowered her eyes again, but this time not from resignation. She had spent months accepting that no one would listen. She had prepared herself for isolation, for silence, even for being forgotten. What she had never prepared for was kindness from someone who owed her absolutely nothing. The wind carried the faint scent of ozone through the square as distant storm clouds gathered beyond the city skyline. Ethan remembered watching similar skies above Lake Michigan when he was a teenager, sitting beside his father on an old wooden dock. His father had once skipped a day's work to help a stranded family repair their broken fishing boat. Ethan had asked why he cared so much about complete strangers. His father had smiled while tightening one final bolt and replied, "Because if everyone waits for someone else to help, eventually no one will." Ethan had never forgotten those words. They had followed him through Marine training, through rescue operations, through long nights repairing damaged orbital stations where anonymous workers depended on systems they would never see. He had learned that machines failed for obvious reasons. People often failed for quieter ones. Fear, convenience, silence. The magistrate studied Ethan for another long moment before turning toward the assembled guards. Instead of issuing the expected order to remove the human, he hesitated. That single pause accomplished something no speech could have achieved. Across the immense square, thousands of citizens witnessed the empire hesitate for the very first time. The hesitation spread faster than any announcement ever could. Imperial guards exchanged nearly invisible glances through the reflective visors of their helmets. The surveillance drones continued hovering in perfect formation, but their soft blue status lights flickered as new instructions traveled through encrypted channels toward the square. Somewhere inside the Imperial Palace, someone with greater authority had chosen not to interrupt. That alone was enough to transform curiosity into uncertainty. The chief magistrate slowly folded his hands behind his back. His voice remained composed, but the confidence that had defined every previous word had become noticeably quieter. "You have requested certainty," he said. "That request carries consequences. Every delay imposed upon Imperial judgment must be justified." Ethan nodded once. "I understand." "Do you?" the magistrate replied. "You have interrupted a lawful proceeding before the eyes of the entire capital. If your reason proves insufficient, your own future may become subject to Imperial review." The warning drifted across the square without menace. It sounded more like an unavoidable fact than a threat. Ethan looked briefly toward the dark clouds gathering beyond the palace towers. A cool breeze swept through the plaza, carrying the faint smell of rain across the polished stone. He could almost imagine the maintenance crews back at Orbital Dock 17 preparing exterior platforms before the weather reached orbit. Ordinary people were probably complaining about delayed cargo shipments, malfunctioning elevators, and broken coffee dispensers. Life continued everywhere else while this moment seemed to exist outside of time. The magistrate waited. "Speak." Ethan looked toward Lysara again. She remained perfectly still beneath the pale columns of light cast by the drones. Her silver hair moved gently with the wind, but her expression had changed. Earlier, she had looked like someone preparing to disappear. Now she looked like someone trying to understand an impossible kindness. Ethan faced the magistrate once more. "If someone must answer for delaying these proceedings," he said evenly, "then let that responsibility belong to me." A low murmur swept through the terraces. Several spectators instinctively leaned forward. Even the officers nearest the platform seemed surprised by the simplicity of his answer. The magistrate studied him carefully. "You would accept responsibility for someone you have never met?" "Yes, even if she has violated Imperial law." Ethan answered without hesitation. "If she has truly been heard, and the truth has truly been examined, then the law will stand on its own. If not, then delaying a decision for a little while is a smaller mistake than rushing toward the wrong one." Silence returned. It was deeper now, no longer the silence of obedience, but of reflection. Lasara slowly lifted her head. No one had ever spoken about her life without speaking against her. Every official who had questioned her had begun with assumptions and ended with conclusions. This human had arrived knowing nothing except that another living person deserved one more chance to be understood. The thought unsettled her more than fear ever had. Above the square, another formation of drones descended from the palace skyline. Unlike the ceremonial units, these carried the polished silver crest of the Imperial court. They moved with flawless precision before stopping directly above the platform. A calm synthetic voice replaced the earlier public announcement. "By order of the Imperial Palace, all proceedings are temporarily suspended pending direct review." Gasps escaped throughout the crowd despite generations of discipline discouraging open displays of emotion. Merchants, scholars, workers, and visiting diplomats stared upward as though the words themselves could not possibly be real. The chief magistrate lowered his head respectfully toward the palace towers. When he looked back at Ethan, his expression held neither approval nor disapproval, only curiosity. "Human," he said quietly. "Very few people have ever caused the Imperial court to pause. Fewer still have done so without wealth, rank, or force." He glanced briefly toward Lasara before returning his attention to Ethan. "His Majesty has requested an explanation. You will accompany us to the palace immediately." The journey from the square to the Imperial Palace took only a few minutes. Yet Ethan had the strange feeling that he had crossed far more than a few city blocks. The transport glided silently above broad avenues lined with crystalline trees whose silver leaves shimmered beneath the approaching storm. Through the transparent side panels, he watched citizens pause in their daily routines to look toward the palace, their personal communication devices already displaying reports of the unprecedented delay. Somewhere, technicians were discussing system diagnostics. Somewhere else, children were asking their parents why one human engineer had changed the schedule of an entire empire. Ethan rested his hands loosely on his knees and remained quiet. Across from him, Lasara sat under the careful watch of two Imperial officers. The restraints around her wrists remained in place, but no one treated her with hostility. The atmosphere inside the transport had shifted from certainty to cautious observation. She studied Ethan several times before finally speaking in a voice barely louder than the gentle hum of the engines. "You should not have done this." Ethan turned toward her. "Probably not." A faint expression that almost resembled disbelief crossed her face. "You understand that your own life may become more complicated because of me." Ethan offered a small smile. "It already has." She looked down at her restrained hands. "Why?" The question lingered between them. It was not demanding. It was not suspicious. It sounded like someone asking about a language they had never learned. Ethan leaned back slightly, watching rain begin to collect against the transport canopy in tiny silver drops. "When I was 12 years old," he said quietly, "my mother stopped our car during a snowstorm to help an elderly stranger whose truck had broken down. We were late for dinner. We missed an important family celebration. I remember asking her why she cared so much about someone she had never met. She told me something I have carried ever since." Lasara slowly raised her eyes. Ethan looked through the rain toward the distant skyline. "She said that kindness only means something when there is no reason to expect anything in return." Neither officer interrupted. Even they seemed to listen. Lasara remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "Among my people, kindness is usually reserved for those who have already earned it." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Maybe that is why we see it differently. She studied him carefully. Your species gives trust before proof? Ethan shook his head gently. Not always. Humans can be suspicious, impatient, and afraid just like anyone else. But sometimes someone has to decide that another person deserves one chance before they deserve a verdict. Lysara lowered her gaze again. I had forgotten what it felt like to hear words like that. The transport slowed as enormous palace gates opened without a sound. Towering walls of polished black stone reflected the gray afternoon sky, while streams of water flowed through narrow channels carved into the architecture, creating a soft rhythm that echoed across the vast entrance courtyard. There were no cheering crowds waiting beyond the gates, only disciplined officials standing beneath elegant archways illuminated by warm golden lights. Ethan noticed something unexpected. Every person present, regardless of rank, was looking directly at him instead of Lysara. Not with anger, not with admiration, with curiosity. An elderly attendant wearing deep blue ceremonial robes approached the transport as its doors opened. He bowed respectfully before speaking. Mr. Ethan Carter, by direct order of His Imperial Majesty Kaler IX, you are invited into the Hall of Reflection before the Imperial audience begins. Ethan blinked in surprise. Just me. The attendant inclined his head. The prisoner will be escorted separately. Ethan looked toward Lysara. For the first time since they had met, she gave him the smallest nod. It carried neither confidence nor certainty, only gratitude too quiet for words. As the attendants led them towards separate corridors beneath the towering palace ceiling, Ethan realized something that unsettled him more than the crowd, the magistrate, or even the emperor waiting ahead. He still knew almost nothing about the woman he had chosen to protect, and somehow that fact no longer seemed to matter. The Hall of Reflection lived up to its name. Every wall was carved from flawless black crystal that reflected not perfect images but softened silhouettes, as though the room cared less about appearances than intentions. Narrow streams of water flowed beneath transparent glass channels in the polished floor, their gentle rhythm blending with the quiet hum of hidden climate systems. Warm amber lights glowed from the vaulted ceiling, giving the immense chamber an unexpected sense of calm instead of intimidation. Ethan followed the elderly attendant through the center of the hall until they reached a circular platform surrounded by empty seats reserved for advisors who had not yet arrived. Please wait here, the attendant said softly before stepping away without another word. Ethan stood alone. For the first time since leaving the orbital dock that morning, there was nothing demanding his immediate attention. No alarms. No damaged reactor. No crowd watching every movement. Only silence. He slipped one hand into the pocket of his engineering jacket and felt the familiar shape of a small steel hex nut he had carried for years. It had fallen from the very first docking ring he repaired as an apprentice. His supervisor had laughed when Ethan tried to throw it away. Keep it, the older engineer had said. The smallest part can remind you why the whole structure stays together. Ethan rolled the smooth metal between his fingers while looking across the enormous chamber. He wondered if kindness worked the same way. Tiny choices holding together things no one could see. A quiet tone echoed through hidden speakers. Massive doors at the far end of the chamber opened with perfect synchronization. Advisors entered first, dressed in elegant robes marked by subtle silver patterns identifying their offices. Scientists, historians, military commanders, diplomatic ministers. None spoke above a whisper. Each took a designated seat, while occasionally glancing toward the lone human standing at the center of the room. Their expressions varied from skepticism to fascination, but none carried open hostility. Finally, another pair of towering doors opened. Every person in the chamber rose immediately. Emperor Kaler IX entered without ceremony. He wore no elaborate crown. Instead, a simple band of dark silver rested across his forehead, matching the understated elegance of his charcoal robes trimmed with deep blue. His turquoise skin carried the calm confidence of someone long accustomed to command, while his silver hair framed thoughtful amber eyes that seemed more observant than imposing. He walked at an unhurried pace, stopping only a few feet from Ethan. No guards stepped between them. The emperor studied the human for several quiet moments before speaking. You are much younger than I expected. Ethan smiled politely. I have heard that before, Your Majesty. A few advisors exchanged surprised glances at the easy reply, but the emperor's expression softened ever so slightly. Do you know why I requested your presence? Ethan answered honestly. Because I interrupted your court. No. The emperor slowly shook his head. Many have interrupted my court over the years. Ambitious nobles, wealthy merchants, political rivals. They all wanted something. He paused, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. You appear to want nothing. The chamber remained completely still. Rain tapped gently against the high crystal windows overlooking the capital. Ethan considered the question carefully before answering. I wanted someone to ask one more question before making a final decision. The emperor clasped his hands behind his back. Do you believe my judge is careless? No, sir. Do you believe my law is unjust? Ethan hesitated. I believe every law depends on people willing to listen before they apply it. Silence settled across the chamber once more. Several advisors lowered their eyes, thoughtfully absorbing the answer. The emperor slowly walked past Ethan toward the panoramic window overlooking the city below. Thousands of lights were beginning to appear as evening approached, each representing homes, families, workers, and children who trusted the empire to protect them. Without turning around, the emperor asked one final question in a voice so quiet that everyone instinctively leaned forward to hear it. Tell me, Mr. Carter, what did you see in that young woman that convinced you to stand before an entire empire when everyone else remained exactly where they were? The emperor remained facing the rain-covered window, waiting without impatience. Ethan understood that this was not a question with a correct answer. It was a question that revealed the person answering it. He drew one slow breath before speaking. I did not see proof that she was innocent. The words echoed softly through the chamber. Several advisors exchanged brief glances. Ethan continued before anyone could interrupt. I saw someone standing completely alone. The emperor remained silent. Ethan looked around the hall of reflection, his eyes passing over the polished stone, the quiet streams flowing beneath the glass floor, and the faces of people who had spent their lives preserving an empire built on order. Back on Earth, he said, I have repaired stations after storms, after accidents, after systems failed without warning. Machines are easy. You replace the broken part and keep moving. People are different. Sometimes what they need most is simply for one person to stop walking away. A senior military advisor leaned forward. His silver uniform carried decades of service. Compassion without evidence can become recklessness, Mr. Carter. Ethan nodded respectfully. That is true. The advisor seemed surprised by the immediate agreement. Ethan continued calmly. But judgment without listening can become something else. The chamber fell quiet again. The emperor slowly turned from the window. His expression remained thoughtful rather than defensive. You believe we failed to listen. Ethan answered carefully. I believe I arrived after everyone had already reached the same conclusion. At that moment, another set of doors opened. Every eye shifted toward the entrance as Lasara was escorted into the chamber by two Imperial attendants. Her restraints had been removed, though she remained under formal supervision. She walked with measured composure until instructed to stop several feet from Ethan. She kept her eyes lowered, unwilling to interrupt the exchange that had already changed the course of her life. The emperor regarded her for a long moment before addressing the room. The official record states that Lasara of House Viral was charged with refusing a direct military command during the Kareth frontier campaign. He looked toward one of the historians. Read the final notation. The elderly historian activated a floating display. Final notation. The accused knowingly refused an operational order during an active conflict, resulting in charges of disobedience under Imperial Defense Statute 41. Ethan listened quietly. The statement sounded complete, yet strangely empty. The emperor noticed his expression. You hear something missing. Ethan met the emperor's eyes. Yes, sir. What? Ethan glanced toward Lasara before answering. I heard what she was accused of doing. I did not hear why she did it. The words settled over the chamber like the gentle rain beyond the windows. No one answered immediately. Even the historian slowly lowered the glowing display, rereading the official record as though seeing it for the first time. The emperor shifted his attention toward Lasara. For months, every hearing focused on whether you obeyed the order. His voice became quieter. Very few asked why you refused it. Lasara slowly lifted her golden eyes. They shimmered with restrained emotion, but her voice remained steady. Because no one wished to know, Your Majesty. Those 7 words carried no anger, only exhaustion. The emperor closed his eyes briefly. Around him, advisors who had defended procedure throughout their careers found themselves studying one another in thoughtful silence. Ethan said nothing. He understood that this moment no longer belonged to him. It belonged to a young woman finally being invited to speak after months of being reduced to a single line in an official record. The emperor opened his eyes again and took one measured step toward Lasura. Then today, he said with quiet resolve, the empire will begin where it should have begun from the very beginning. He paused, allowing the silence to settle over every person in the hall of reflection. Tell us why. Lasara stood motionless for several seconds, as though she no longer trusted her own voice. The hall of reflection remained perfectly still. No advisor interrupted. No official hurried her. Even the rain outside seemed softer now, its steady rhythm blending with the quiet streams beneath the crystal floor. She drew one careful breath before finally speaking. The order I received was simple. Her golden eyes settled on the polished stone beneath her feet. Our fleet intercepted a civilian evacuation convoy, leaving the Kareth frontier. Intelligence believed enemy officers were hiding among them. My commander instructed every vessel under his authority to destroy the convoy before it reached neutral territory. A faint murmur spread through the advisors. Lasara continued with calm precision, as though reciting memories she had repeated silently for months. I requested permission to perform individual scans before carrying out the order. The request was denied. I asked again. I was told that hesitation endangered the empire. She slowly lifted her eyes toward the emperor. So I refused. The chamber became silent once more. Ethan watched her without moving. There was no anger in her voice, no attempt to defend herself through emotion. Only truth spoken after carrying it alone for far too long. One of the military commanders rose from his seat. Records indicate that the convoy escaped because of your refusal. Lasara nodded once. Yes. And enemy personnel may have escaped with it. She accepted the statement without argument. Perhaps. The commander folded his arms. Then your refusal carried military consequences. Before Lasara could answer, the emperor quietly raised one hand. Continue. Lasara looked toward the wide crystal windows where rain blurred the distant skyline. 3 days later, long after I had been removed from command, independent patrols located that same convoy beyond the frontier. There were no military officers aboard. She paused briefly. There were teachers, engineers, farmers, medical workers, more than 200 children. The words settled over the chamber with astonishing weight. The historian standing beside the official records slowly activated another archive display. His fingers moved faster now than before. Line after line of forgotten reports appeared across the glowing screen. His expression gradually changed from concentration to disbelief. Your Majesty, he whispered, supplemental reconnaissance documents were filed 6 months ago. Every eye turned toward him. He continued reading carefully. The convoy was verified as civilian after secondary investigation. The information was archived under restricted military classification and never attached to the judicial review. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Shocked silence. The emperor remained completely still. One by one, advisors requested access to the archived files. Each reached the same conclusion within moments. The missing evidence had existed all along. It had simply never reached the people responsible for judging Lasara. Ethan closed his eyes for the briefest moment. His chest felt lighter, not because he had been proven right, but because the truth had finally been allowed into the room. The senior military advisor who had questioned Ethan earlier slowly rose from his chair. He looked toward Lasara before lowering his head with quiet respect. Commander Lasara, he said, history may remember that you disobeyed an order. He paused before continuing. But today history must also remember why. The emperor walked toward the center of the chamber until he stood between Ethan and Lasara. His gaze moved from the recovered records to the human engineer whose only request had been for one more question to be asked. A thoughtful smile, small but unmistakable, appeared across his face. Remarkable, he said softly. An empire possessing every document still failed to discover the truth. His amber eyes settled on Ethan. It required someone who possessed none of the evidence to remind us that understanding must come before judgment. Morning arrived beneath clear skies for the first time in days. Sunlight poured across the Imperial Square where the interrupted ceremony had begun, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. The towering obsidian pillars still stood in perfect symmetry. The banners still moved gently in the breeze. The same polished stone reflected the light of 3 distant suns. Yet something invisible had changed. Thousands gathered once again, not because they had been ordered to witness an ending, but because they had been invited to witness a beginning. Emperor Kaler IX stepped onto the central platform without fanfare. His voice carried naturally across the silent plaza. Yesterday, this empire nearly made a decision without hearing the complete truth. No one moved. That failure belongs to all of us, beginning with me. A quiet wave of surprise passed through the crowd. Few rulers spoke that way. Fewer still accepted responsibility before their own people. The emperor turned toward Lasura, who now stood freely beside the platform in a simple blue ceremonial uniform instead of restraints. "Commander Lasura of House Viral," he said, "the charges against you are formally withdrawn. Your record will reflect not disobedience, but moral courage shown under extraordinary circumstances." The square remained silent for one heartbeat before respectful applause slowly spread outward, growing naturally instead of erupting all at once. It sounded less like celebration and more like relief. Lasara lowered her head, unable to find words large enough for the moment. She had expected freedom to feel triumphant. Instead, it felt peaceful. The emperor then looked toward Ethan, who stood almost uncomfortably near the edge of the platform, wearing the same worn engineering jacket he had arrived in the previous morning. He had politely declined every offer of formal attire. "Mr. Ethan Carter," the emperor said, "you asked for no reward, no title, and no privilege." Ethan smiled faintly. "I still do not need one, Your Majesty." A few quiet laughs rippled through the audience. The emperor returned the smile. "Perhaps not. But civilizations remember examples even when the people who set them never asked to be remembered." He removed a small silver insignia from his own ceremonial robe and stepped down from the platform instead of asking Ethan to come forward. The unexpected gesture caused every advisor and officer present to follow his example. Standing at eye level with the human engineer, the emperor placed the insignia into Ethan's hand. "This does not recognize what you accomplished yesterday," he said softly. "It recognizes what reminded us who we must become tomorrow." Ethan looked at the small piece of silver, turning it thoughtfully between his fingers beside the old steel hex nut he still carried in his pocket. One represented an empire. The other represented an ordinary repair job completed years ago. Somehow they felt equally important. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh rain across the square. Children sitting on their parents' shoulders watched the ceremony with bright curiosity instead of fear. Merchants reopened their stalls. Musicians quietly returned to the surrounding streets. Life resumed, but not exactly as it had been before. Weeks later, Imperial legal scholars quietly added a single sentence to the front of every judicial review throughout the empire. Before judgment became final, one question would always appear. Has every voice been heard? No decree mentioned Ethan Carter by name. None needed to. His shuttle departed the capital on schedule the following morning. At Orbital Dock 17, another damaged reactor awaited repair, another maintenance report needed filing, and another ordinary workday began exactly as countless others had before. When coworkers asked why news channels across the empire kept mentioning a human engineer, Ethan simply shrugged and picked up his tools. Far above the planet, as his repair platform overlooked the endless stars, he tightened one final bolt and smiled quietly to himself. In a galaxy that admired power above all else, the rarest force had never been strength. It had always been the courage to stop, to listen, and to remind a stranger that their life was worth one more question.